Excellent. Well, hello, everybody. Ken Bevis, Wildcat alumni, et cetera, et cetera. And I will peek at the chat every now and then, but maybe my moderators can keep track of that better when I speak directly in the microphone. Okay. And so I'm going to share with you today a presentation that I cooked up in regard to something that I've always been interested in, and that was one of the drivers of my experience there at Central, studying woodpeckers and snags, and we'll get to that here in a few minutes. But I want to talk about dead trees as part of forest trees, and we came up with this title as a bit of a tongue-in-cheek reference to a campy 1980s movie, but a dead tree's excellent adventure. There's nothing bogus about dead wood. Remember Bill and Ted, these two guys, and they made that little movie that was a big hit? Well, yeah, they did one sequel last year, but they're going to do yet a second sequel coming right up, and it's going to be called Bill and Ted Face the Snag. It's going to be all about dead wood and how important it is to the future. So stay tuned for that one. Casting has started. The soundtrack's not quite done, but there we go. So just speak about forest ownerships and a little bit of what I do. This is a commercial for this cool job I have now. Small forest landowners own about 4.5 million acres in the whole state, and there's about 219,000 families that own somewhere between 5 and 2,000 acres in these particular corners of the state. The dark green are these ownerships, and my project basically is kind of like extension work to help people do good land management in these places. And I'm the wildlife biologist, so I'm sort of loyal opposition that my job is to include biodiversity elements and in particular wildlife habitat in recommendations to these people through this program. So I'm the wildlife biologist of these three guys who cover the whole state: Rob Lineberger, Eastern Washington; Matt Preventure, Western Washington; and myself. And we work really closely with WSU Extension, like Li Xing mentioned. And so there's our program contact. And it's a totally cool job because I'm basically a technical consultant, free, that's what people like about us, and an educator using the skills that I learned as a graduate TA at Central to spread the word around. And so I'm going to give you a little presentation today about something near and dear to my heart related to the forest. So here's a little outline: forest dynamics, what's a tree, primary cavity excavators. I'm going to do a song, management, a little bit about management and down logs, and then tell a real story about what happened at our house, particularly relative to habitat. And so I'm just assuming that my sound levels are okay. Li Xing, we still sound okay? Yeah, okay, good. Yep, I'm seeing some other nods too. Thank you, Steve. And so here we go. So forest. when we look at a forest, it's really easy to assume that it's static, but they're in motion and they're growing. Like this alder stand is only 25 years old, and look at that big snag sticking back in there. There's a 110-year-old second growth forest over near Olympia, Miller Sylvania Park. This was completely logged over in like 1920, or actually earlier than that. And here's a 600-year-old stand out on the Quinault rainforest. And when the species mixes could be the same, but the shape of the forest, the way that the trees lay and everything will be really different, and it's changing all the time in slow motion. All these different features in the forest, like a big dead tree like that. I'm going to say more about that. But when you look at a forest, really look at the structure of it and imagine how they change. Well, forests are made out of trees, duh, obviously. And trees are indeed three-dimensional habitat features that change with time. So there's a lot of different elements to a tree, meaning the branch tips versus the stem, the roots themselves, but they're changing over time. And in a natural forest, and I say a natural forest meaning one that hasn't been, homogenized into like a tree plantation, that trees will be in many different ages, layers, states of, there'll be old trees, there'll be little trees, there'll be dead trees with big holes in them like this. This is a pileated woodpecker excavation a big one, going way deep into this Douglas fir. So they'll be in different stages of growth and decay, and every tree has a unique story. And like you see one like this is a grand fir with a healed scar. It may be hollow in the middle. Here's a whole bunch of Douglas squirrel cone frass all around it. And so every tree wears its story on its surface, and they as they grow, things change. Okay, well, trees also, they die regularly. And when trees die in the forest, they tend to do it in either small groups, like a few at a time, like where one tree died from root rot or bugs or something, or a whole bunch at once, the classic being from a fire. So in the dynamic of this changing forest, death happens. So in Western Washington, and I've learned a fair amount about this, small-scale tree mortality often comes from root rot, which is a endemic set of fungal organisms in the soil that will get into trees and eventually clog up the tubes and make the tree die. And they do it in these little slow motion pockets. And back to a fire, a big pulse of dead trees. This was 1 year after the Carlton complex up near Twist, where this whole stand of trees, was killed. This was a fire. This picture was taken 25 years after, the fire near Sherman Pass, and all those standing dead trees still there. So anybody been to Yellowstone? I always ask this question in a in-person class. And if you've been to Yellowstone, most of us have, since 1988, when the big fires were, there's still a lot of standing dead trees in Yellowstone, like lots. And the ones that aren't standing are laying there on the ground. So, you have other types of events like wind throw or hurricane storms. On the west side, it turns out this happens a lot, where trees snap off, like this microburst up near Colville a few years ago. That was about 10 acres of snapped off trees, that were basically killed in this sudden weather event. Well, all these different ways for trees to die. When you go out in the forest, you often will find old dead wood, and something like this that was scarred in a fire that broke off a long time ago. Mechanically, this is able to stand for a long time because there's not a lot of weight up above it and that sort of thing. And whatever the event that killed the tree, the wood always persists for a long time. And this is one of the key points today, is that dead wood is a very persistent ecological feature. So let's circle here a little bit and say, all right, now what is a tree? Well, thank goodness I went to Central Washington University Department of Biology, because by the time they were done, you guys were done with me, I could answer this question. That a tree is indeed a large, magnificent plant with lots of different defense mechanisms: pitch tubes, thick bark, waxy leaves, all of these things in order to keep fungus and insects out of the organism, which is not really a unified organism, which I think is sort of interesting. It's a whole series of parts, all organisms are like that. But there's something interesting about a tree, that a tree is not a, well integrated organism. So, here's a groovy Bing diagram. I hope, I don't know who did it, but, in a tree, remember that the xylem, let's see, where is it? I got to find it on the thing here, is moving moisture, water, and nutrients from the soil up to the leaves, and the phloem, is moving photosynthate from the leaves down to the roots. So you have this two-way conduction going on. And the only part of a tree, somebody could correct me on this if I say this correct, but I like to say the only parts, by definition of life, which could be defined as cell division and metabolism of some kind, then the only parts of a tree that are alive are the cambium, obviously, where cell division is going on, the leaves because of photosynthesis, and the root tips for the sake of cell division. And otherwise, it's all dead tissue. Is that fair? Did I get that about right? Somebody correct me. Is that close enough for lay people? Yeah. Okay, good. Thank you. Because a tree is mostly dead tissue, and wood is really a series of little tubes or straws, the tracheage, and so the outer part, the xylem, this cedar tree in a log deck, there's the xylem right there, the sapwood. You can't see the phloem, but this part in here is no longer conducting. So the heartwood is acting as support tissue to hold up all of this stuff that's going on. And trees will often get some kind of fungus or something going on, and they can compartmentalize these things and continue to live. So every hollow tree in the world became hollow while it was still a living tree. So a tree is mostly dead tissue. It's mostly wood, and wood is a great, amazing thing. So a tree, when it has its defenses intact, the wood itself is usually mostly functioning in those mechanisms that I just described. But the tree dies. Something happens, whatever it is. The phloem clogs up. There's a scar, drought, a fungus, but the tree dies. And as soon as it dies, that cambium is where the most active carbohydrates and sugars are, and it goes away within a year or two. When it's fresh dead, you look at a fresh dead tree, it's still got all the fine branches. And by the way, this is going on under the ground too, that the fine branches are down under, the fine root tips are there down under the ground. And early on, the bugs, boy, they come right away to go after that cambium. And when you see these kind of holes in the bark of a tree, that's a woodpecker going in after these guys, these shallow dwelling, mostly beetles, but insects that are living in that cambium layer. And so within just a very few years, the cambium is gone, the fine twigs starts to dry out, and after a couple of decades, if the tree's still standing, that it hasn't rotted out at the roots, it can break off. It might get lucky enough to get a woodpecker cavity in it. Then they start to break down into these soft features under the influence of many different fungal pathways. And it's sort of predictable. Excuse me. This is an interesting diagram. I actually think these numbers are too quick, but this is from the Quinault Rainforest Nature Trail, which, by the way, is a really cool, excellent place to go visit. And, look at the dates here. So here's 2 years out. It's still got the fine branches. 6 years. See, I think 6 years it's going to look more like this. But, you get the idea. 15, 40, 70, 100 years later, there's still a standing dead tree there. And I have made the comment more than once that I think a tree lasts about the same amount of time after it dies as it did when it was alive, or longer, depending on the circumstance. I'm going to speak to that here a little bit. So it falls over and becomes a log. And the same decay sequence works on the diameter and type of wood on a log too. So the fine branches, the leaves and the fine stuff goes away quicker, and then the log itself, the wood, takes a while to break down. And as they decay, they create different substrates for different organisms. And I think this is a really interesting spot right here, where this stem that was cut in about 1950, the ground here has I think it's called colt's foot, somebody told me. And then the wood of the tree, and also on the vine maples here, we might add, are covered with moss and a whole different plant community on the wood as a substrate. Well, here you go. Here's the classic is the nurse log. There's a little spruce tree coming out of this one here, and the same thing right here. So wood, laying on the ground is a whole nother ball of wax, and it breaks down slowly. It becomes soil. It feeds the system. And it can take a long time. Even in a fire ecology, the big logs won't burn up, and they will still go through a longer decay process. But it can take a long time. Scientists have this issue, though, that when you're trying to measure the amount of decay or the rate of decay in something like that piece of wood, it's really hard to quantify in the field, because they're just so big and there's so much variability. So there's some subjective systems that have been devised. And I used this on my master's thesis, trying to describe the snags. And I remember having an argument with Professor Darda one time about whether it was a stage 2 or a stage 3. How do you know? And I know he was testing me, but it was a really good point, But you can definitely tell a difference between say, a stage 3 and a stage 7. Nobody's going to disagree with that. A 4 and a 5, But anyway, point being, this is how you would quantify that. So, important thing that we've learned really in the past probably 50 or 60 years is that dead wood is essential to natural forest ecology. I think people had an inkling of that for years, but for a long time in forestry, the assumption was just, trees emerged from the soil and all this stuff was kind of in the way. So dead wood is essential to natural forest ecology, and it's great habitat. It's a great habitat feature that carries a whole set of organisms that I'm going to speak to right now. Let's see, has anybody got some burning comment right now? Okay, no, good. Thanks for that ASL there, Glenn. Nicely done. That's what I was going to say too.
Yeah, I'm the ASL interpreter. Thank you.
Yes, well done. Okay, let's see. Here we go. Okay, so dead wood is great habitat too. So what sort of organisms use this stuff? So let's take a look at a few of these deadwood dependent wildlife species. This one's my favorite, the pileated woodpecker. So the primary cavity excavators are woodpeckers, and that's actually a descriptive class of birds. They're in different genuses. They're not even all in the same family, but the woodpeckers will use that amazing chisel on the front of their head to carve a hole into a tree to either feed, to go after insects, boring insects, or to create nest cavities we're going to speak to for a minute. And I'm going to show you something that I absconded with from Central here pretty soon. But these what do you call them? Rectangular holes in big trees, that's diagnostic of pileated. And they will go back to the same tree to go after carpenter ants in other times. So this is right outside of my office window. I'm looking at it right now. I can't quite see it because of the snow pile. But I actually planted this snag in the ground at a strategic spot right by the bird feeders and everything, so I could see what comes and lands on it. And one morning, this fellow came, and my wife, Terry Piper, got these photographs of a pileated woodpecker basically on our planted snag. And woodpeckers have this remarkable 2 toes up, 2 toes back, very stiff tail, and they percussively prospect for insects. They'll go up a tree and they'll kind of tap. And I like to imagine that guy right there was listening to see what was crawling around inside of the snag there. This is a male because he has the red mustache and the red going all the way to his nares. But anyway, pileated woodpecker, just a rather astounding animal. And they will go back, I started to say this, to the same carpenter ant colonies, or go deep into the wood to go after these things. This is a wood boring larvae of a longhorn beetle, I believe. That's a flathead borer. Hopefully there's an entomologist in the group who could tell me exactly what it is. And this pileated woodpecker was a reject from the Burke Museum that wound up in the dust bin at Central, and it is now on a log in the Department of Fish and Wildlife's office in Ellensburg if you need to reclaim it or revisit it. So Phil Maddox, there's where that old pileated wound up, and he was pretty beat up. So this is about a 70 or 80-year-old piece of taxidermy. No, it's not my tame woodpecker. So thanks for the loan of the woodpecker. Other species of primary cavity excavators, red-naped sapsuckers, hairy woodpecker, kind of the everyman's woodpecker, occur in all different forest types, can use smaller trees about the size of a robin, black and white. The little ones, a downy woodpecker. Birders are always having fun trying to determine a hairy woodpecker from a downy woodpecker, and you put them side by side. A hairy is considerably bigger, and the downy has this little teeny beak. This is a male, by the way. You got red-breasted nuthatch, and of course the flicker, wick, 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 all excavators that will use these trees. So, there are highly trained and educated scientists studying primary cavity excavators and deadwood ecology, producing important publications that will last for years. This is right over there in the library at Central. Dave, go over there and pull it off the shelf, and I want to see how many people have checked it out since it came out, because it is a vintage classic from the last century, 1994. Through 286 pages long. There's 5 copies in existence, and we haven't quite finished the movie version yet, but we are working on the soundtrack, which I'm going to share part of with you right now. So some of you know I play my guitar and I like to write songs. So I wrote a song about woodpeckers, and we're going to try this little tricky mechanism here for the sound. And I'm going to have to reach up to change the frame. So bear with me there. Okay, is that sound check? Sound check. I'm a woodpecker, the king of the trees. I got padded brains, I do as I please. Hey, hey! I'm the king of the woods. I'm a crazy red hammer, I make cavities. Homes for you, homes for me. Hey, hey! I'm the king of the woods. Uh-oh. Sorry. Oh, there we go. I climb up the tree, tapping tappy tap, listening for that insect cave. I find that hollow sound, I axe my way in, and I slip in my sticky, sticky tongue. Yum! I'm a woodpecker, the king of the trees. I got padded brains, I do as I please. Hey, hey! I'm the king of the woods. Crazy red hammer, I make cavities. Homes for you, homes for me. Hey, hey! I'm the king of the woods. I got a rhythm in my bones, I'm synchronized. I bang on the highest place I find. I play my licks, I whack my tricks, I bang on my tree drum, and sometimes I sing just for fun. Ho-da-da-ha-ha, ho-da-da-ha-ha, wicka wicka, wicka wicka, hey hey, I'm the king of the woods. Ho-da-da-ha-ha, wicka wicka, wicka wicka, hey hey, I'm the king of the woods. Rhythm break. Hey hey, I'm the king of the woods. Uh-oh. I'm a woodpecker, the king of the trees. I got padded brains, I do as I please. Hey hey, I'm the king of the woods. Hey, hey, I'm the king of the woods. There you go. Did that work, Glenn? Okay, cool. Yay, thanks. That was fun. Let's see, I'm going to check chat here to see if that sounded okay. Where am I? There we go. Cool. All right. Thanks, Red Panda. Thanks, Joe. Okay, good. That's reassuring because I've had some failures at attempting to do music by way of Zoom. So yeah, so woodpeckers are a really, really interesting set of birds. And every year they have this really interesting habit where they make a new nest cavity, or they at least clean one out. So woodpeckers don't use nest boxes hardly at all because they just have to do it themselves. They're like those, like the guy that has to build his own everything. And so when you see that little round hole in the tree, little round, I mean, it could be a pileated, it's like 4 inches across, hairy woodpecker 1.5 inches, flicker 3 inches. There's a lot going on in that thing. And they do this remarkable behavior where they chisel that thing out from the outside, flicking the chips. The male does the work of excavating the cavity. The female comes along and says, yeah, that one's okay. We'll take that one. Well, this is a really good place to raise a family because nature red and tooth and claw, baby birds are yummy stuff for predators. And so if you had a cavity, and both parents will brood the young, both parents will feed the young. So woodpeckers are remarkably cooperative in how they raise their families. But it's a really good spot to bring your kids up. And woodpeckers have a high fledging rate. And here's why. Because these cavities, holy smokes, right? This is a cross-section of a pileated. You can't really see this, but that's like 2.5 feet deep right there. And this distance of the diameter of the hole to the bottom is consistently about 2.5 to 3 times ratio that. So here's the bird sitting here on eggs with a chisel attached to their face. Now, if a squirrel or some bad guy tried to come in through the door, what would happen? Right, exactly. It's an easily defended situation. So it's a good place to raise a family. And this is a remarkable adaptation because woodpeckers actually are keystone species in the ecosystem because they can change a solid block of wood into cover, food, water, cover. So they can change the environment to benefit themselves and others. So good cavity snags, and this is from observation over years of doing forest work, are often broken off. And the dynamics of a tree in regard to the mechanics, a lot of times they'll break right at the bottom of the crown because I think that's where there's a significant fulcrum point, when a tree is green, it has a lot of flex to it. When it dies, it becomes more brittle. And when they break off like this, well, then the decay comes in from the top, or it's already started. Here's a flicker cavity that had a kestrel nest in it right there. There's a nest right there. Here's a really soft old one that's got a lot going on. I love these kind of trees, and every now and then you'll see one out there. But like, look at that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I think there's 6 visible on this side, and there's 6 on the other side. And sometimes there'll be trees that are softening from the top, and the woodpeckers will make a series of nest cavities in the same tree, and they'll just kind of work their way down as the tree softens. So a lot of times they're broken off. Here's one that was up by Tonasket, up in east of Tonasket. And this is a big larch, which, by the way, are really, really good cavity trees. And I wish I could see this a little better, but there's 2 pileated holes right there. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. There's like 14 cavities on this side of this tree. And on the other side, there was an equal number. The fellow that owned this, and this tree is probably 36 or 40 inches in diameter, and had been there. The fellow that owned the land, he had bought the land like 35 years earlier. And he said when he moved there, that tree looked about the same. And it had been this perennial wildlife habitat hotspot with woodpeckers and other species in the tree at the same time. So that's a really, really valuable habitat feature. Here's another one with a shorter one with a cavity in it. This one is up near Tannum Falls. This tree was in the Evans Canyon fire, and I'd be really curious to see if it's still there. You could see it from the road up past Tannum Falls up over the top. So somebody go look for that one. Now this is one from over on the Olympic Peninsula. This is a big broken off spruce snag on a property. So every year they make a new cavity, and most year that cavity is abandoned, and lots of other species come in and use them. The secondary cavity species, including bluebirds. There's a mountain bluebird. Here's a tree swallow. Tree swallows being one of my favorite beautiful birds, harbinger of spring. Here's a kestrel. Bird watchers, male or female? Pause. That's a female because the back is brown, not blue. But they're a secondary cavity species that use abandoned woodpecker holes. Here's some more brown creepers, chickadees, wrens. Wrens really like cavities. There's the swallow again. Little owls. So no owl in the world knows how to make a nest. And the little owls, the saw-whet, the pygmy, excuse me, the screech, for example, they will readily use abandoned woodpeckers' cavities and may indeed have to have them in order to succeed at nesting. Screech owl, here you go. Look at this guy. And don't they look like bark? That's an old branch scar on a cottonwood in a hollow part of a tree that may have been widened out by woodpecker. Cavity nesting ducks, that always strikes me crazy. Ducks nesting in a tree, like the wood duck, hooded merganser, goldeneye. And so there's a fair number of these birds that need to find a cavity. Or mammals, flying squirrel, like the one that told the story earlier. I walked out in the woods with my then Professor Dave Darda, and I said, if you bang on a tree, sometimes with a cavity in it, sometimes something will jump out. And I hit this snag with a stick, and a flying squirrel jumped out. Dave, do you remember that? And it's never happened since, but sometimes it works. So mammals in cavities, flying squirrels, Douglas squirrels, bats. Bats have to have some kind of a roost site, and they really like woodpecker cavities. A martin. I've seen martins sticking their heads out of woodpecker cavities too. So cavities, good habitat for the woodpeckers and for the secondary species. The log falls over. Well, now it's home for a whole different set of species, and these include little stuff, salamanders, snakes, lizards, small mammals. If you look right along the edge of a log, sometimes it looks like almost a game trail going right under the edge of the log, where the mice and the voles will travel back and forth under the partial cover of the log, or will live in the log or under it, down there in the duff below it. Yeah, little stuff. So the log universe is a different one than the standing tree, but it's very, very rich too. Yeah, and it's moist inside of downwood. And I pulled the bark off of this tree on a field trip with a bunch of forest landowners, and I was showing them the beetle tracks right here. And there was a chorus frog, a tree frog, right under the bark. And this was in the upland, which was pretty interesting. So there they were using the habitat. They last a long time. I know I've already said this a couple times, but down logs can persist for centuries, so I don't know how long that one's been there. This one was over in the Quinault again, and they had a little interpretive sign that this one had been down at least 150 years with these good-sized trees growing right out of the top of it. So this is a bearing witness here. So I visited this landowner near Moclips. Anybody know where Moclips is? If you don't, Moclips is on the southwest quadrant of the Olympic Peninsula, over there near the mouth of the Quinault River. And as you can imagine, that is wet, 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 wet. And somewhere about the turn of the 20th century, and I like to imagine this was during the time when they were taking those big spruce trees to build those cool biplanes, this tree was cut down. This lady's the landowner. She's got her hand in the springboard notches. So the old-time loggers would, climb up there with the boards and the crosscut saw and all that stuff. And Dave, we were looking at this thing, and she wanted to show me her stump. So it was at least 10 feet in diameter. Well, laying right next to it was this. And this was the butt log from that tree. So that stump we were just looking at is right behind you in this picture. And this was the bottom, probably 20 feet of that tree that was either too big to move, or they couldn't use it, or who knows what their reason was. But point being, over 100 years later, in one of the wettest places on the continent, a soft tree, a spruce, is almost intact. And so this just is giving you a glimpse at large wood log decay, that it takes a long, long time. And so I just thought that was a really, really cool circumstance there. So these dead wood habitats, they're important. They're important for lots of species, for lots of soil function, all of these things. So dead wood is cool. Well, it keeps breaking down. And I bet everybody in the audience here has done this at some point in time, gone down and dug around in the duff, that stuff that's been breaking down. And you always find something cool. If you're lucky, you might blunder into a northwestern salamander. Dave, I think that's what that was, rather than a Pacific giant. And, insects, oh gosh, millipedes. Is millipede an insect? Springtail, that's a springtail. Boy, I got to watch myself here. Now I'm in with a bunch of biologists. People actually could call me out on my BS. So, but there's a termite, I believe. And here's a Insatina guarding its eggs. I did not take that picture, but that's a cool picture. I think that's an Insatina. Dave, did I get that one right too? Okay, can't tell. So here we go. So down there in the duff, the fungus is doing its thing. It's dissolving the wood, and it's in a amicable, slow manner, feeding the soil creating this remarkable ecological set of relationships. Remember, mushrooms are just the fruiting bodies of all the mycelium, and particularly in Western Washington, but we're kind of the great kingdom of fungus. There's a lot of really interesting fungal work going on, particularly in the forest floor. So just that particular point, that the dead wood trajectory is pretty darn rich, so rotting wood feeds the soil, and thus it feeds everything. You want to learn about a cool critter, slugs. Slugs are really interesting. And here's chanterelles. That's a real bounty of the land kind of thing right there. So I always hammer this point home, and I get to give a version of this presentation to foresters and to loggers. I even do help with a contract loggers training. And I always say this, that there's like about somewhere 38 to 40% of forest vertebrate wildlife are dependent on dead wood for some part of their life cycle. And the list is long, and pileated woodpeckers, flying squirrels, other squirrels, salamanders, on and on and on. And you could tie life histories of a huge number of species back to the presence or absence of dead wood. And so that's just, there's almost no other single manipulated habitat variable in the forest environment that can have as big of an effect on the persistence of the wildlife biota as dead wood. So I love this quote: "Such trees are dead, true enough, but theirs is a lively death indeed. More species are associated with the tree after it's dead than there are when it's alive, and it simply is because they can get into the wood and do stuff." So, well, this comes up. Now we get to the little management section of the talk here. Well, I used to do forestry. I still do it kind of, but I used to review harvest proposals, and I would always be bringing up the issue of snags and wildlife trees and everything. And they would say, "Oh, there's plenty of them. They're over there." And they would sort of indicate the riparian zone, which had a 50-foot strip. Well, this picture right here, this is a Western Washington clear cut, obviously. And here is a lone wildlife tree down along a creek, by the way. There was like a 100-foot buffer with a bald eagle nest right in the top of it. It's like, yeah, I'd count that as a wildlife tree. But this stand back here has been reset all the way back to zero, and there's no advanced wood standing structure there. There might be a few logs around, but not even very many of those. It looks like they yarded almost everything here. So, so harvest obviously diminishes the dead wood trajectory. And this is something that we do all the time, hazard tree removal. People are afraid of dead trees. People think they're ugly. People will insist that they be removed. This was in a hardly used picnic area up in Ponderay County, this beautiful hollow cedar tree, and they cut it down for the worry about safety. And it was like, nobody even comes here. Oh, I'm still mad about that tree. Or firewood. How many of us have gone out and cut down dead trees for firewood? Probably just about everybody here. How many of us were raised on the premise that dead trees were going to waste and we needed to, put them to good use? I'm one. And so firewood gathering has been a long-standing, perpetual, what's the word? Degrading factor in forested environments, particularly where there's a lot of road access. So firewood gathering is not a trivial thing. So, all right, fine, Ken, dead wood's important for all these groovy species. How many do we really need? And so there's been some work. And what do you mean need? I mean need to maintain viable populations. In fact, that was part of what Primary Cardiac Surveys of Granford Forest Washington's East Cascades, Granford Forest Washington East Cascades tested was the Forest Service assumptions about percentages of potential population based on a assumed direct relationship between snag abundance and bird abundance. And we sort of demonstrated that in my own sloppy way. So you'll have to go check it out to study those results. And if anybody wants to write it up into an article, I would happily co-author that with you. So how many do we need? Well, Honestly, it's complicated because a larger dead tree provides for more species, meaning there's more opportunity for, a hole for a tree, a loose bark for a bat, whatever. Soft snags, ones that are already in advanced decay, are needed for weak excavators, for example. And some tree species actually have better characteristics for cavities. Now, I have to add that my commentary here is biased towards cavity trees, ones that could be used for creating and maintaining a breeding and roosting cavity. That does not address the potential value of, let's say, a dead branch on the side of a tree that could have insects in it for feeding. So this is my bias here. So how many do we need? Well, in Washington State, interestingly, the forest practice, or if you want to log your property and you're going to cut more than a log truck load of commercial timber, maybe most of you know this, but you have to get a permit through the Washington Department of Natural Resources Forest Practices Division. And what it is a set of mandated best management practices that are instituted through a permit system. And there's penalties for not meeting the terms of the permit. The stream buffer's got to be a certain distance. You can't log in a unstable slope. It's actually one of the most restrictive forest practices systems in the whole country, and it's remarkably successful. We can actually be proud of the way that it works. And I say that as somebody who was oppositional to it for a long time, but I've had some professional interaction with this since 1998. And one of the elements of it is that wildlife trees are built into the rules. It says how many wildlife trees that will provide habitat for cavity nesting species you have to leave per acre. However, safety always trumps. If an operator says, no, I'm afraid of that one, they can cut them down. And so most of them are removed. Sometimes they'll get them out there and they don't make them. Well, my small landowners, I say mine, I'm taking some ownership of these good people like Gina and Pita here. They love wildlife, and they often are really interested in ways to maintain wildlife on their property, because that's one of the values that they hold very, very highly. And so this is what I recommend to them. I say, well, try for 4 per acre if you're going to count them, but hardly anybody counts them. But the best strategy is to know what a really good one is and make sure you keep those. Those are those broken top ones, the ones with cavities in them, on and on. Bigger in diameter is better. Broken tops are great. I'll take whatever species we can get, only because if you tried to be too particular, you wouldn't get them on the landscape. Some do last longer than others, like Douglas fir is a really good one because they stand a long time. Small diameter ponderosa pine tend to rot out at the roots and tip over. But the very best ones are cedar, Doug fir, big ponderosa pine. Grand fir is actually a really good cavity tree. The hardwoods are the best when they're still alive, like cottonwoods or aspen, because a lot of times you get a dead top in a hardwood that can be a really good cavity source, and those can stand for a long time. Oh, BLM is a big leaf maple. Those are actually really good cavity trees too. So, in a management setting, these are really good ones here. These are some of those examples of good ones, and the woodpeckers are telling us, look, we got holes in them here. So make these, mimic nature. I mean, you could hire a climber to go up and knock the top out of a tree, and I'm going to tell you about this tree here in just a minute. So yeah, know what a good one is. Here's one up at Suncadia, up there by Roslyn, and I'm going to say something about Suncadia here in just a second. Yeah, these climbers, if anybody ever worked with an arborist, because arborists are this interesting group of people who are cross between craftsmen and artists, and always a little bit crazy, and they love to make habitat trees. And so if you say to an arborist, hey, can you snag that tree for me? They're like, yeah, sure. Like Owen here, he was all over it. It was a great thing. You can also create them if you don't have them by girdling. You can cut through the cambium, and this tree right now is standing there as a dead tree. I need to go get this same picture again, but that's another way to kill some trees. You could girdle them up at the top. This was an experiment on the Cedar River watershed. If you're harvesting, most logging now is being done with these big harvesting machines. And I don't know if anybody in this room will have a chance to be part of planning a harvest, but watch this. Okay, see if this will work. 1001, 1002, 1003, 1004, 1005, 1006, 1007, 1008, 1009, 1010, 1011, 1012, 1013, 1014, 2015. In 15 seconds, that big machine created about a 8 to 10 foot snag right there that's going to stand for, 80 years, 100 years. And 8 foot is a minimum height, 10 inches in diameter, 10 to 12. This really isn't aimed at you, but I tell people, make it part of your contract. Tell them, I want 20 stubs, because otherwise the operator, they usually forget. Some of them like it, some of them do it. It's pretty darn interesting. And it works. Okay, so next time you drive up to Roslyn, go into where Suncadia is, the big fancy golf course place up there. And right inside the entrance where that cool sign is, in the median, there's one of these trees. So I had a chance years back to help give a wildlife input when Phil Hess and was hired as a consultant to lay out the site prep for what was then, let's see, what was it called first? Mountain Star. What was before that? Not Suncadia. Trend West. It was Trend West, then it was Mountain Star, then it was Suncadia. And they laid out these big harvest units. And Phil said to me that they wanted to have wildlife as one of the features of this high-end community. Do you have any suggestions? And that stand of trees right outside of the town of Roslyn in Cle Elum was flat. If you remember, people were riding motorcycles all through it and running around out there shooting guns and all kinds of crap for years and years. Well, there wasn't a snag in sight, because people had cut them for firewood consistently for years and years and years and years. Well, what the heck? I said, well, Phil, why don't you guys make some snags? And to my utter astonishment, he said, okay. He said, how many? I said, 2 per acre. Okay. They made over 500. And the big felling machine, while they were harvesting, went around and snipped like that guy just did. Well, that was in the year 2000. This picture was taken in 2013. And if you go to Suncadia today, 20 years after that first batch was created, they're full of cavities. It is so interesting. The Doug firs are still standing. Some of the pines have fallen over, but there are bluebirds, woodpeckers, sapsuckers, probably squirrels and things in that development that I'm convinced would not be there if they hadn't have created this habitat feature at a big scale. And they like it so much, they even made some more recently, which is pretty cool. So you have right in your backyard a really good example of the success story of creating snags. So I would say a little bit about fires here real quick, because I mentioned earlier that after a fire, there's lots of dead wood, and our instinct for utilizing wood is, well, we got to get those dead trees out of there. Well, ecologically, I don't know, that's a whole another interesting topic. But after a fire, there is a lot of dead wood, and it's a pulse, it's coming in. Well, the fire recovery is really complex, and I'm sure some of you have gone up into Jolly Mountain now, and we're going to get to see this on Evans Canyon in spades in the shrub steppe. But this was Carlton, burned this aspen stand. This picture was taken in like October 1st of 2014. The fire was July 18th of that same year. That aspen grove had sprouted back. Today, this aspen grove is like 20 feet high, and most of these stems are still standing, but a lot of them have fallen over. Well, the dead wood from a fire is actually important to helping stabilize the soil and all these other things, and it becomes this rather remarkable habitat. So some of you know this. I live up here in the Methow, and in 2014, the Carlton complex, actually a secondary fire, but it was during that time, almost burned our house down. And so my wife Terry and I, we own a piece of property, and this is what it looked like in, I think, 2011. Open grown pine stand. Look at this bitterbrush understory. This was a really rich bird habitat. We had lots of shrub nesting species. We had nuthatches. We had evening grosbeaks in the trees. We had some Douglas squirrels. We had lots of hummingbirds. We only had one snag on the place, interestingly, and not very many woodpeckers. Well, but so we enjoyed our trees. Well, August 1st, 2014, this happened. A trailer got a flat tire on the highway a mile from us. 45 minutes later, a wind-driven brush fire, bone-dry conditions, 100 degrees, roared across this hill. And this picture is that last one was taken standing right over here by the house. Oh, and the firefighters came and saved our house. If they hadn't have come, our house would have burned down. And 10 houses in the neighborhood did burn down. So this picture is from the edge of the driveway. That next picture is taken from right over here looking down into the same stand of trees. So these two trees right here are these two trees right here. So that's a rather dramatic change. I mean, it burned up everything. We found chipmunks and rubber boas, and I was hopeful that some of these trees would survive. They did not. None of them survived, and the whole thing died. Well, we started into our rehab, and one thing that I did was I hired an arborist to top. He topped 14 trees. Here's one right here. Remember this tree right here. And the idea was to get the weight out of the top of the tree with my idea that they would last longer. And nature's played a pretty solid joke on me that most of these trees that we topped are still standing, but an awful lot of them broke off mid-canopy. And so you'll see here in a second. And this is what it looks like. This was May of this year. So those other two pictures were taken right up across here. And this is looking back up through that stand of trees. Well, this is that pine forest you just saw a picture of. That's what it looks like today, 6 years after the fire. Well, there's more birds. I think we have more birds than we did. And notice the understory. Look how the shrub layer and the grass and everything has recovered. It's just totally amazing how lush the understory is. And as you can imagine, after 6 years, and it took about 3 or 4 for them to get soft enough to start to get cavities, but I've counted them. I now have 52 broken top snags just down here in this stand, and I had at least 8 cavities of various woodpeckers in them. So this is that same tree that the arborist topped in that other picture. And last year there was a kestrel nest in a flicker hole in the top. There was a flicker nest partway down the stem, and there was a mountain bluebird down here towards the bottom in this single tree. So we had this pretty darn amazing bird fauna come into our snag forest. And in a kind of like the universe playing a joke, the snag guy owns a snag patch now. And I wish I had been more systematic about my monitoring, but I did set up a series of photo points that I've shot every year since when it was just ash. So I'm going to have an interesting record of the changes from that. So I work on this project called the Woodland Fish and Wildlife I don't know what you call it, committee, and it's a series of white paper articles that are aimed at small forest landowners, and I co-authored one last year called After the Burn. So check out that website, and you'll see this whole series of articles. Some of you may be familiar with them, and if you have an idea, excuse me, something we need to do, in fact, I think Dave Darda actually helped me with the amphibian one. So there we go. But this is about on that very topic. So almost done. A couple take-home messages. Did I mention deadwood is important to forest habitat? I think I slipped that in there somewhere. Yeah. That it provides crucial habitat for a third. Half is exaggerated, but 38%, something like that. Dave Darda, there you are. I see you, big guy. And it can be provided for in management. This is a really important point, because it's not a throwaway. Oh, they're over there. No, it's not. You really need to pay attention at this habitat. And they're beautiful and they're full of life. And so part of our mission as naturalists and biologists is to pound that home any chance you get, And so this is an interesting thing. So this is kind of my mission. I'm an evangelical snagist, I've described myself. And we need to insist on maintaining and creating these habitat trees everywhere. And that means like in city parks, you could top a tree and leave it there as a squirrel tree, not just for specialty, not as a boutique exercise. And this group right down here to the lower left is a success story that I'm going to brag about. It's the Derlin family. They own 160 acres up by Lake Wenatchee. Two brothers bought this property years ago, and it was a former clear cut by Murray Pacific in like 1975. It had been clear cut, and then they planted it back. Well, think about that. It's like 40. It's a 45-year-old forest, and there's not a snag in sight. Well, this son right here, he happens to be an arborist, and they got the snag bug, and he has been going around making snags. He's climbing trees and sawing them up. I did a tour with him. He's like, "What do you think of that one?" I was like, you are so good. So it's pretty cool. It can be a really useful thing. So healthy forest, we hear lots of talk these days about forest health, and generally that seems to mean thinning and getting rid of dead wood and all this stuff. Well, a healthy forest includes dead wood, and it includes these key pieces of the really good stuff. So you can have a fire resistant forest like this stand right here and have a great big beautiful woodpecker snag in it, consciously maintained or even created so that that element of the habitat persists. So there you go. That's kind of my run to done, thanks to photos to these people: Greg Thompson, Con, my wife, Bing, and I thank you so much. Here's my email. Send me a note. Send me a picture of a good snag or a woodpecker story. And I want to thank the Central Washington University Department of Biology, because I think I was a little bit glib back in the day and didn't appreciate how much you helped shape my thinking. And I'm saying this aimed specifically at Dave and Paul, who are here on the call with us, because you guys did such a good job of helping me figure out my way through that kind of wide open, almost sloppy study, and how to think about science. And that is probably one of the greatest gifts that you gave to me. It wasn't so much, sending me out in the woods and everything, but helping me put in context all that information that I gathered. So I humbly and sincerely thank you for that. You guys have been important to getting me this far. So here I am, white muzzled towards the end of my career. I'm like one of the old timers now too. And it's a rather awesome responsibility to have to push this stuff along. So be happy to entertain a few questions here. We could probably do it live feed if you want. I got another song up my sleeve if you want to stick around a few more minutes. But there we go. At least sing. I don't know how you want to do this.
Yeah, let's entertain some questions. It's a Friday. It's a little over time, but no, it's a Friday.
It's Friday. That's right. Go get a beer. Okay, let's see.
Yeah.
I see. Oh, I want to see more of those do not cut signs. I am about to order a bunch of signs, and I'm going to try to get Kittitas Audubon to help me pay for them. So there you go. Dan Beck, yes, the rubber boas were on the surface after the shrubs burned up, and they were burned. Yep, they were burned, and I think the ravens and the dogs would find them and eat them, and the chipmunks too. We actually found a fair number of singed chipmunks. Yep, we did.
That's their barbecue.
It was, yes. They were crispy critters.
Yeah.
Oh, now here's a really good, Clay Arango asked a really good question. How do you address deadwood and fire versus deadwood and wildlife habitat with landowners? Clay, go to that Woodland Fish and Wildlife series, and we did one called Wildlife Friendly Fuels Reduction, because basically you are going to reduce the fuels on about 85% of the acres. You're going to, and clear around the house. Fire-wise, it's like, the first 100 feet, habitat in my butt, that's fuel. But beyond that, you can do some glading, you can leave some clumps. Big snags are not a fire risk, even big down logs. Essentially the 3-inch rule, anything 3 inches or smaller. Again, back to Suncadia. They've done some really good work on maintaining habitat elements in fuels reduction projects. So that's the way I approach it. Is I say, okay, I get it. We need to reduce the fire risk. We want to make sure we reduce the fire risk on the key places close to your house, steep hill, but we're gonna have skips and gaps, and we're gonna use my acronym is SLOPS. So the elements to maintain is snags, logs, legacy, openings, patches, piles, and shrubs. I should somebody find that link and put it in chat to Woodland Fish and Wildlife, because that, and you know what, and Clay, that is kind of one of my missions, to try to figure out ways to get that into the litany. Yeah. Paul says, did I study snags or birds for my research? It was both, Paul, and it was the relationship between the two. And I said one time, well, this is a shelterwood, and you said, I don't care what the foresters call it. You tell me how many trees there are. Something like that. It was good. Yes. Let's see. Do I recommend topping trees to different heights for more? Yeah, that's a good idea. I think the biggest thing is that you don't leave so much crown that they still have the leverage to tip all the way over. The goal is to have it be a woody cylinder that persists until it breaks apart, because it's going to wind up as a log anyway. And if you cut the top out of it, you can leave the top on the ground as a log, so you can kind of get both. So I've actually thought sometimes the mistake is people will top them too tall. So I've started to think like somewhere between half the height of the tree and a third. So if you had a 120-foot tree, a 40 to 50-foot stub with most of the branches off, and then the top kind of jagged up so it looks natural, and there you go. So yeah, that's a very good question. What would be a good balance between keeping dead trees and preventing high-intensity fires? I would suggest that keep the bigger dead trees and focus on continuity of fine fuel. So what's the most flammable thing in our forest? It's green conifer. Green conifer needles are the most flammable thing out there. So yeah, the balance is site by site. And I mean part of this is relative, but if you turn loose the fuels reduction crews, and I bet some of you have seen this, oh my God, they will space the trees out to 25 feet. They'll limb them up. They'll grind up everything. They'll park the thing out. And people like that. It's really interesting the way that it looks all tidy and clean. And so, how do you balance that? That's a very good question. So that's where I say 15% of the area in habitat elements, including skips, 30 feet wide and 50 to 100 feet long, all the big snags, and then the rest of it, snags and logs. And identify really good shrubs. Like if you had, say, an elderberry, and these shrubs, if you have, say, an elderberry, a really good wildlife plant, and it's gotten really leggy, it's really one of those big long ones, well, you can actually whack that thing off, like prune it all the way back, and it'll sprout back like crazy. The shrub layer is remarkably resilient, but it takes a couple years to recover. So there you go. If I was a snag, what species, diameter, and height would you be? Who says I'm not a snag? Let's see. Probably, I'm partial to cedars, but they do the best when they're still alive. Say a 48-inch Douglas fir, 50 feet high, 50 to 60 feet high, broken off with only a few branches left, and in a deep soil setting, so I could stand there for multiple centuries full of pileated woodpecker cavities. Nice. Thank you. Steve, there you go. Yes, thanks, Chan. Okay, leaving 2 snags. There we go. Good question. Would dead trees become refugia for bark beetles? Generally, no, because the bark beetles, the bad bugs, are only there for the first couple of years of the life cycle of the dead tree. And this did happen here when the trees were killed by the fire. I think we actually did have a little bark beetle outbreak that went out and killed a few of the surviving trees along the edge, but then that outbreak faded out. So bark beetle outbreaks are kind of like a flame. It goes and it'll go, but it doesn't necessarily just go totally crazy wild. And it's a very interesting dynamic. So they can be a temporary bump, but they don't really act as refugia, because once they're well down the decay path, it's all about breaking the wood apart. It's wood borers and other things. I think that was a trick question. Did I get it right?
Yeah.
Nice. Yes, there you go. Fungal logs. Are fungi able to climb snags before they fall? I think so, Anthony. Anthony asks if fungi, quote, climb snags. I think that fungus, the mycelium, they can spread, up the stem, but there's a whole different complex. Well, I don't know. I need a mycologist to really help me know that, but I think yes, they can. And a lot of times when they fall, it's because the roots have rotted out. And I think this is an interesting tidbit too, that the heartwood gets infusions of chemicals that essentially help trees resist rot. You think about heartwood versus sapwood, and roots will have heartwood in them. Roots, if they're big enough and old enough, I think they will persist and resist some of the rot too, which would wind up being part of the physics of a snag staying vertical, because the whole thing of staying up is almost an engineering question of how much of a base. You think about tree roots, and as soon as a tree dies, the fine roots start to disappear too. So the fine roots are gone. Now you've got this platform down there, and what's it in? Is it like that big snag on Umtanum Road has probably got heartwood roots wrapped around rocks, and the top is going to bust out, and that thing is going to still be there because it's got heartwood on dry rocks, and it's probably not going to rot very fast. So yeah, I don't know. That kind of stuff is really interesting. Okay, if you leave 2 snags per acre, what about the surrounding trees and shrubs? Are there still many trees remaining? Steve, it depends on the harvest unit. Yeah, it depends on the harvest unit. Oh, Dave Darda, you're doing CWU proud too. Yeah. Slash piles good, but not as good as snags for wildlife. They're almost two different things. Like piles, I didn't do my whole spiel about habitat piles, but piles can be fabulous habitat features. And a slash pile is usually unconsolidated logging material that's just thrown into a giant heap. And with those mechanical logging operations, the slash piles are enormous because they'll do whole tree processing at the landing, and they'll haul the tree in, and then they can do all of the processing by way of some big, chop, loaded on the truck. And then here's this big pile. Well, they usually burn them, not always, and they can be good habitat features. But I would say dispersed, larger diameter dead wood, if you had to choose the most natural and best strategy, that would be it. The right number of down logs. And ironically, if you had a stand, well, like the one right here at home, I mean, just this stand right in front of my driveway, 52 broken top snags with at least 8 cavity nest in that 3-acre area. That's a lot. And I think that they're kind of packed in there because the habitat conditions are so good and they're willing to tolerate each other. If we only had one snag down there, I'd only have one cavity nest, so it's all relative. Habitat is a fluid changing thing. What fun. Oh my God. You know what? You get me going. So yeah, Dave and Paul, that's what happened to me. I ran with the dead wood theme, and I appreciate that question, Paul, whether I studied snags or birds. I think it was both and how they interacted. So, I have a reputation in my profession as liking dead trees, and so.
Ken, I had to ask you that because I asked you that 26 years ago. So I just wondered what your answer, if it stayed the same.
Did I give you the same answer? No, I didn't.
No, of course not.
Because Paul, I believe you asked me too. You said, if I had an infinity of snags, would I have an infinity of cavity nesting birds? You asked me that at my defense, and I still think about that. And the answer is no. There would be territorial limitations, but you could pack them in a lot closer. So yeah. So again, my sincere comment about thank you for challenging my thinking, and I hope you guys are still doing that to all those poor innocent children that come wandering through the halls of knowledge there.
Was that a traumatic question?
No. They did me good. I was so pleased. And I even managed to get a job right out of grad school, so it's worked out. Yes.
Well, wonderful. Thank you so much, Ken. Let's give Ken a round of claps for his informative and entertaining talk. Thank you so
what
much.
fun.
Yeah.